first one I'm talking about is the Septuagint, and it's abbreviated LXX. That's a Roman numeral. L is the Roman numeral for 50, and X equals 10. So L plus X is 70. And Septuaginta is the Latin word that means 70. According to legend, this isn't historical, according to legend, after Alexander the Great conquered the world and Greek was the international language, the Jews in most of the empire of Alexander's empire spoke Greek. The ones in Israel, they still spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. But in places like Alexandria, Egypt, they spoke Greek. And so, just like American Jews, they learn a little bit of Hebrew for their bar mitzvah. But if they really want to know what the Hebrew says, they'll ask the rabbi. They want to read their Bible in English. So the Egyptian Jews, they wanted a Greek translation. And so that's why the Septuagint was made, about 200 years before Jesus. And most people, unless you're a scholar, don't read Greek. But if you want to know what the Greek says, there are two English translations. One is from the 1800s by Sir Lancelot Brenton. I give you his name there. If you Google Brenton Septuagint, you'll find hard copy that you can buy, but there are also websites where you can read it for free. And the other is the NETS, a New English translation of the Septuagint. It's done by scholars at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is available for free on their website, but you can also go to a bookstore and get hard copy like I did for this one. The Septuagint was the Bible for early Christianity. The very earliest Christians knew some Hebrew, but everything in the New Testament is written in Greek. So when New Testament authors quote Greek, every now and then it looks like they've translated the Old Testament. Some of them knew some Hebrew. But more often, they simply quote the Septuagint. They don't make a fresh translation. And most of them couldn't have made a fresh translation. There were other Greek translations, Theodotion, Aquila, and Symmachus. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these. There was a great scholar, Origen, who lived about the year 200, and he made the Hexapla. It was the Old Testament in 6 columns. Hex is for 6. Column 1 was the Old Testament in Hebrew. Column 2 put the Hebrew into Greek letters so that people who didn't read Hebrew could read how it sounded. Then column 3 was the Septuagint, column 4 was Theodotion, column 5 Aquila, and column 6 Symmachus. So you had the Hebrew written in Greek letters, and 4 different translations of the Hebrew going in columns. And unfortunately, it was burned up when the library at Alexandria was burned. Then there's the Old Latin translation. Once Latin-speaking Christians started to be Christians, they wanted a Bible that they could read. The earliest Christians in Rome were Greek. They were slaves. Greek was their language, and Paul writes to them in Greek. And, you know, a lot of people say, oh, I like the old Latin prayers, Father, like Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison's not Latin, it's Greek. It was a litany, and it was very popular. And so even when the liturgy was put into Latin, the parts that the people did, like Kyrie eleison, a lot of them stayed in Greek. Miserere Domine would be Latin for Lord have mercy. But eventually there were enough who read Latin. So what happened was that the Septuagint got translated into Latin, and that's the Old Latin translation. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated OL, or sometimes VL, which is Latin for Vetus Latina. So it's the Old Latin translation. Then was the Latin Vulgate, which Jerome did in the 4th century, and we'll pass this around, and we get our word vulgar is related to vulgar, but it doesn't mean vulgar in the sense of coarse, but vulgatus means common or ordinary. So this is not highfalutin Latin, but this is ordinary Latin for simple people. This is the 4th century version of today's English version. The 4th grade reading level Bible, this was the Bible for everyone to read, the ordinary Latin. Then there were Aramaic targums. Targum is the Aramaic word that means translation. The ancient Israelites spoke Hebrew, but Hebrew was just a dialect spoken in a very small part of the world, about the size of the state of Vermont. Whereas the international language from India all the way to Syria and down to Egypt, before Alexander the Great came, the world language was Aramaic. And what happened when the Jews were in exile, Aramaic became their common language. They were there for over 50 years. A lot of them, when they came back, no longer spoke Hebrew. The scholars did, but the ordinary people now were speaking Aramaic. So when the Hebrew scriptures were read, they needed a targum. They needed a translation. And originally what would happen is they would read it and translate it. Hebrew, Aramaic, and then somebody started writing the translations down. And so we have some of these targums at Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then there are other targums. I'm using the English, the Aramaic plural would be targumim, but I'll just say targums. There are targumim from the 1st and 2nd century AD, and these are helpful, but often they're highly creative, especially in the poetic parts. And when I was studying, I read a little bit of, had a semester on Targum Aramaic, and in the story in Genesis where Abraham is afraid that Pharaoh is going to take his wife because she's so beautiful. That's what the Hebrew says. The Targum then goes on, and they're so proud of their first matriarch, Sarah, and say, oh, her hair was like this, and her eyes, and her lips, and she had a nice figure, and just on and on about, and like the Hebrew has 3 words, and the Targum has like 2 paragraphs saying how beautiful this woman was. So if a translator sometimes will be accused by fellow scholars of Targumizing, that's being highly imaginative in your translation. Then there were Syriac translations. I'm going to pass around this Syriac Bible. You'll see it's in a different alphabet. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. Aramaic is the language also that Jesus spoke, but it's written with a different alphabet. And what's funny is when Rabbi Klein and I are studying, he can't read the Syriac because he doesn't know the alphabet. But if I read it out loud, he understands what it means because he knows Aramaic. And I have a similar problem when we're looking at Jewish medieval stuff. Some of it is done in what's called the Rashi script, Rashi alphabet. I can't read it. But if he reads it out loud, I'll understand what it says. So Syriac, there was an old Syriac translation, and then the Syriac Peshitta. Scholars make lots of jokes about getting your Peshitta together. But Peshitta is the Syriac word. It means ordinary, just like Vulgate does. So basically this is the Bible in ordinary Syriac, the Bible for ordinary people, not highfalutin. Oh, and I need to say, when I was talking about Jerome's Vulgate, if you have an old Catholic Douay, it is a literal word-for-word translation, almost perfectly, of Jerome's Vulgate. So we have translations of the Septuagint, translations of the Vulgate. It's harder to find translations of the Syriac. But anyway, what value are ancient translations? Well, for one, they show us the history of belief, because when the people are translating, they are putting their understanding of religion into their translation. So there are parts of the Old Testament that refer to the sons of God. And in advanced courses I go into that ancient Israel was polytheistic. They believed in many gods. They were only supposed to worship the Lord, and on their good days they only worshiped one God, but they believed that there were many gods. So what happens, though, is by the time of the Septuagint, all Jews are fanatical monotheists. And so wherever it says the sons of God, the Septuagint just writes angels. So these other gods have been demoted to being angels. And the Targums, they don't like those passages that are anthropomorphic, and the Septuagint does this too, where God is presented in human imagery. And so it might talk about the face of God. Well, the Targum will say something like, and they saw the glory of God instead of the face of God. Or instead of the right hand of the Lord smote them, God's power smote them. So the translations show us how religious thinking was developing from primitive to later thought. And then also they are helpful for textual criticism. Sometimes the Hebrew text is a mess. And sometimes if we look like at the ancient Greek and say, oh, if you translate this Greek into Hebrew, it doesn't say pots, it says stop. So it doesn't say when you get to the end of the road, pots. It says when you get to the end of the road, stop. And the Hebrew scribe was dyslexic, and so the ancient Septuagint is the oldest, but also the Aramaic Targums and the Vulgate and the Syriac. These will sometimes help us to correct the biblical text. So those are the contemporary uses of ancient translations.